Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second in our webinar series for aspiring chief executives. My name is Louise Beals. I'm principal consultant here within our interim management practice, and I'll be hosting the session today. As many of you know, Starfish Search is a leading provider of talent across civil society and local government. And together with our board and executive search practice, we support candidates and clients with critical appointments. I'm delighted to introduce you to our speaker today, Kira Estelle, who will be leading the discussion on mastering the chair and chief exec partnership. This is a pivotal relationship that is vital to the success of the organisation that you may find yourself leading. We hope that you find this webinar insightful and that you'll feel able to contribute to our Q&A session after Kira's presentation. Kira, over to you.
Thank you, Louise, and hi to everybody joining over lunchtime. I did the first session for the Aspiring CEOs Network a few months ago. I think it was in March, on being an accidental CEO. So it's really nice to come back and be with you again to talk about this pivotal relationship, as Louise says. So let me just bring up my slides and I can get started. We've got plenty of time for Q&A. So do, as we go along, put your questions into the chat and we can pick it, Louise can pick it up later. You don't need to wait until the end. So here we go. So this is me. If you didn't come along the last time, I'm Kira, and I've worked for, well over 25 years in the public and charity sector as both a CEO of a charity called Libraries Unlimited, and I've also been a chair too. So I come at this kind of discussion, I suppose, with experience on both sides of the relationship. As an aside, but you might want to ask me some questions about this later, I'm also very interested in co-leadership. And I support, as a coach, facilitator and consultant, a number of chief execs and senior leadership teams within the charity sector, but also the growing number of co-CEOs and also co-chairs. So co-leadership is a really interesting part of the chair-CEO dynamic. Now own my own business, working across charity sector, higher education, arts and culture, and I'm an honorary professor at the Centre for Leadership at the University of Exeter Business School. So I suppose I bring a bit of kind of theoretical perspective as well as my own experience, my own lived experience, and also my experience of supporting others. So that is me. Here I am. This is a photo from my days as Chief Executive of Libraries Unlimited, and pictured there is me alongside our chair at the time, Julie Dent. And here is the organisation that I was a chair for. So this is an organisation based in Kent called People United, that works at the intersection really of the arts, care, kindness and creativity. And I was the first chair of the organisation when it was set up, well, over 15 years ago now. So interesting to be a kind of founding chair. I'm also a non-executive director of a community interest company, a social enterprise company called the Real Ideas organisation based in Plymouth. And I'm also a governor of Arts University Plymouth too. So I suppose I have quite a lot of non-executive experience. In terms of the session today, what we're going to talk about is the kind of role boundaries and responsibilities of the chair CEO. It's a really critical relationship, the chair CEO one. And I think when you come into a role like this as a new CEO, I think you can think that your key relationships are with your senior leadership team, with your service users, with your funders and your partners, maybe with the local authority, health, wherever. And of course, those are all incredibly important relationships. But the relationship with your chair is probably the most crucial relationship of all. So talking about the role boundaries, where's the split between the chair and the CEO is a really important part that we're going to cover today. I'm going to talk about some common pitfalls and how you might avoid them, strategies for building sort of trust and collaboration, how you might prepare for your CEO role, some of the things you might want to ask at interview, and some of the things you might want to put into a plan for your first 100 days. And I'm going to share some useful resources that are out there, and you may have some useful resources too. So do feel free to share any resources that you've come across too. And as I say, plenty of time for Q&A. So in terms of why this relationship matters, I mean, it's so important, this relationship, because it absolutely, the kind of relationship that you have with your chair does set the tone for the entire organization's culture. It drives strategic direction, it drives good governance, it enables effective decision making, and it definitely supports risk management and accountability. And I'll be talking about all of that in this session. When the relationship works, the whole organization benefits. And when it doesn't, conversely, it can create confusion, frustration, and huge risk for the organisation, and in fact for the CEO themselves. My personal belief is that, and I think this is overlooked in the literature when you look at this, but I really believe that the quality of the relationship between the chair and the CEO has a massive impact on the well-being and performance of the CEO. So when the relationship is good, when trust is high, when the chair CEO relationship feels like a relationship that's based on trust and mutual respect, when the CEO gets regular feedback on their performance, all of those things help foster massive positive well-being for the chief executive, and that definitely has a ripple effect on the wider senior leadership team and beyond. Conversely, of course, the opposite is true too. When the relationship is not going well, when it's fraught, when there are power plays, or the chair is absent, it can really have a negative impact on the chief executive and beyond. So it's really a relationship that's hugely important. So role boundaries and responsibilities, who does what? And this is the kind of, a really crucial question. And I've definitely seen it done in different ways, but the kind of prevailing literature and best practice would say that the chair leads the board, holds the board, chairs the board, manages the board dynamic, ensures that good governance is happening across the organisation, in committees, at board meetings, outside of those formal events, that decisions are logged, everybody is clear, people feel involved, all of the things that are tied up in good governance. And that their role is also to both support and challenge the chief executive. If you've not been a charity CEO before, it's a very interesting relationship to get used to. It's not a pure line management relationship, but the chair has a very important role to play in both providing that support, but also some useful, positive challenge too. The chief executive's role is, as you know, to lead the organisation, to implement the strategy, and to manage the sort of day-to-day operation of the charity. And there are definitely some areas that are shared responsibilities between the chair and CEO. So the strategic vision and direction for the organisation, the values, the sort of sense of the culture of the organisation, and to some extent stakeholder engagement, whether that's with service users, funders and partners, can be a sort of shared responsibility. So that's it at a kind of high level, and you definitely ask me questions about that later, but that's how it should work within a charity. So an interesting quote here from Third Sector, which is a magazine, online magazine, and a quote here: "The chair of the board and the chief executive of a charity must neither get too close nor too far apart for their relationship to work successfully," which I think is a really useful way of thinking about the relationship. And you may be taking screenshots of these slides, but I'm sure the colleagues at Starfish can send these slides out with the recording so you can access these later. So what are the pitfalls involved when things potentially go wrong? And then I suppose the number one area where things can potentially go wrong is where the role boundaries I mentioned before are unclear. This can happen, I think, where the chair oversteps their authority, interfering effectively with the day-to-day management of the organisation. This can absolutely mean that the chief executive feels undermined, and actually also that the board really loses sight of its strategic oversight role. I have to say I saw this happen a little bit during COVID, when quite naturally and understandably chairs and boards in general, I think, often had to get much more involved than is normally the case, because it was such a strange time and there was so much that needed often to happen within charities. I think my sort of take on this is that most chairs and chief executives actually navigated this pretty well. But I do know some chief execs that felt that their chairs were at risk of kind of overstepping their reach. And I think I'm seeing it again a bit at the moment, actually, as so many charities are facing huge financial challenges, and the chair and often the sort of chair of the Finance and Audit Committee are having to get much more actively involved than they normally would be in the day-to-day financial oversight of the organisation. You know, lots of charities, unfortunately, are at risk of not being going concerns or having very significant financial issues, which means that the chair and several trustees are getting much more involved than they would be normally in sort of specially convened working groups. And you can see why chairs can sometimes fall into this kind of trap of getting, well, not trap, but they can fall into overstepping this role, partly because of kind of the financial climate, things like COVID, but also changes in regulations, increased media attention. Charities are so much more in the public eye and scrutinised than they would have been in the past. All of that, I think, can put pressure, a feeling of pressure on boards and chairs to be more involved, and that leading to overstepping boundaries. Now, of course, it can happen the other way too, where a chief executive becomes overly dominant, potentially undermining the board's oversight. I have absolutely, and maybe some of you have seen this within your own organisations, I have seen chief executives with big personalities, sometimes the founders, the people that set the charity up in the first place, where their presence and their profile is so high within the charity that it becomes very difficult for a chair to offer the proper oversight and challenge needed in the chair function. Role boundaries, I think, can be a bit blurry. You know, I've said how those roles and responsibilities are clear at one level, but so much of this is about navigating together with your chair about where does the boundary stop and start. So having those discussions very explicitly about that from the start, I think, is really important. A kind of related challenge, or maybe it's a different challenge, is where there's a lack of kind of regular open communication between the chair and the CEO. Some chairs, particularly if they're in full-time work or they've got lots of other responsibilities, may not actually have the time it needs to be a good chair. When they took on the role, maybe somebody persuaded them into it, or maybe they thought it was a good thing at the time, or maybe the circumstances have changed since. Maybe they just didn't fully understand the time and commitment involved, or somehow they just thought it would be okay. You know, it's often busy people, and I'm one of them. We can take things on and hope for the best, and actually we realise afterwards we should have had more time to give to things. And I've definitely seen that happen when a chief executive feels just very unsupported, and when nobody is really keeping an eye on them personally, but also providing that kind of oversight that's needed. So a chair that is distant, disengaged, and doesn't really have the time to engage with their roles is a huge problem, particularly if the charity is going through a challenging time. It's absolutely crucial, but actually at any time, that's really important. So regular open communication is crucial for a healthy chair-chief exec relationship. And I think if communication is infrequent, inconsistent, or marked by conflict, it definitely can add to feelings of distrust and misunderstandings. Moving on to thinking about conflicts and strategic disagreements, the chair and chief executive might have differing visions for the charity's future, or different approaches to risk and growth. You know, many charities are going through sort of fundamental rethinking of, do they need to merge? Do they need to get bigger? Do they need to contract? And those sorts of issues, people are going to come at it from a different perspective often. And so where there is a significant lack of alignment between the chair and the chief exec about the direction of travel, that is a problem, and can cause real issues. So it's really important to ensure that your views and ideas are aligned as much as possible with the chair. There's obviously always room for kind of healthy debate and disagreement. That's a given. You need to have those sorts of conversations, but you absolutely need to make sure that there is a shared sense of the kind of strategic direction for the charity. If these things don't get tackled, they can definitely escalate into kind of bigger issues, more wide-ranging issues. So those sorts of things need to be kind of discussed early and tackled early and not ignored. Underperformance is another area where things can go wrong. So when a chief exec's performance is felt, a chief exec is felt to be underperforming, or the direction that they're taking is concerning, it can put a strain inevitably on the relationship. The board quite rightly will feel that it needs to address those issues, but doing so with sort of sensitivity and doing it constructively is really vital. If it's the chair that's underperforming, that's a whole other area that's much more challenging, and probably that might come up in our questions and answers later. So underperformance can go either way. Personality clashes, of course, even with the best of intentions, personal difference in working styles, temperaments, approaches to leadership can sometimes hinder that kind of collaborative spirit that you're trying to build with your chair. And then an inexperienced chief executive and a chair. And when I think about my time as chief executive of Libraries Unlimited, it took me probably 3 years to really understand. I'd mostly worked within local authorities, so I was quite new to being a chief exec of a charity. And I think it took me quite longer than you would think to really understand good governance and actually how I needed to develop and grow my relationship with the chair. So it does take time, I think, for a new chief exec and a new chair to find their feet and to fully understand the nature of that relationship. And I think as a new chief executive, it can be very helpful to have, as I did, a very experienced and supportive chair who can help you find your feet as a chief executive and help you understand the importance of good governance. Conversely, I think it's not at all ideal to have both an inexperienced chief executive and an inexperienced chair. I think you've got to have one that's experienced somewhere within that relationship to help and support one another. The scope for things going wrong if you're both new and inexperienced is quite high. So, talked about some of the pitfalls. Here's some of the things in terms of sort of setting yourself up for success, really. And some of this leads from the things that I've just talked about, but establishing regular check-ins, really important, that regular exchange of information between a chair and chief executive. In my view, a chair and CEO should, as a minimum, have a weekly catch-up on the phone, or on Zoom, Teams, whatever, and ideally, not ideally, they really should have a monthly face-to-face meeting. It's a bit like a marriage, isn't it? These sorts of relationships, you've got to put the work in, you've got to be regularly talking to build that sort of sense of trust, and also for the chair simply to know what's going on. So establishing regular check-ins, I think, is really important. Clear roles and responsibilities, as I said before, helps prevent conflicts, misunderstandings. So regularly looking at and updating role descriptions and terms of reference, I think, is really crucial. It can feel unnecessary in some ways, but I think starting with those descriptions and talking about areas where it is a bit blurry, I think helps make it clear on both sides who's responsible for what. So it helps make sure those boundaries are sort of respected and reduces, I think, the likelihood of power struggles. So clear roles and responsibilities, developing that sort of shared sense of a shared vision and strategic priorities that align the board and the executive team. So I think, in my view, strategic planning should be a collaborative process involving both the chair and CEO alongside other trustees and the senior leadership team of the charity. And I think by ensuring that sort of joint ownership of the charity's mission and future direction becomes much easier to manage disagreements that may arise around competing priorities or differing views on priorities. Regular appraisals for both chair and CEO can help identify and address issues early. And it still surprises me, actually, that, well, not that many chairs get appraised. I have done some independent appraisals of chairs with a kind of governance when I've done board effectiveness reviews for charities, which I've done a few times, and sometimes done independent 360 feedback sessions for chairs, but it doesn't happen as much as you think, and it should be something that's happening for both chair and CEO. And doing those kind of regular appraisals can help identify and tackle issues early before they become problems, and it gives a kind of environment where feedback can be easily offered within the organisation. We're not very good sometimes at kind of giving and receiving feedback, but if you can build a culture of giving and receiving feedback well within an organisation, and you can model it at the top, I think that's a really powerful cultural change for an organisation. So the board should conduct annual reviews of the chief exec's performance. I think that does tend to happen, but the chief executive should also have the opportunity to give feedback on the board's governance and any changes that they might feel would be worthwhile pursuing. And all of that, I think, builds a culture of mutual accountability, and helps address performance concerns in a very constructive and non-confrontational manner. Then there's something about kind of open and transparent communication, particularly about challenges. I think the chief executive really needs to appreciate the role of the chair and the board and recognise that they are accountable to regulators, to the Charity Commission, to whoever else might be a regulator in your particular sector, that they are responsible for that, for the management and oversight of the organisation. So I think it's really important to be transparent about challenges and for there to be no surprises between the chief executive and the chair. I think it can be tempting as a chief executive to hide things from your chair when things go wrong, but it is always better to be open and transparent about what's really going on so that it doesn't come to bite you on the bum later. I've talked about shared alignment of key decisions. From my experience as chief executive of Libraries Unlimited, I would meet with my chair before a board meeting. We'd be identifying what the key decisions were that were coming up, and we'd make sure that we were aligned. My chair used to say to me, "I don't mind between us, Kira, if we disagree when we're having discussions, but when we're with our board and anywhere else, we need to be showing ourselves as being aligned together." And that really worked for us. Other things in terms of strategies for setting the relationship up for success is what I called there the kind of right kind of challenge. I think the role of the board is not to really rubber stamp, to do your homework, but to provide that sort of effective challenge to the executive team. And to be effective, that needs to be healthy, constructive challenge and not aggressive, confrontational challenge. So it need not result in conflict at all. And that does mean, I think, that CEOs need to ensure that sufficient relevant information is provided to the board in advance of meetings. And board members, of course, also need to make sure that they are well prepared for a meeting and showing up having read all of the paperwork. And then the meeting, a healthy meeting, can have that debate, acknowledging that opinions might differ, and there's more than one route to a destination, but remembering always what the common goal is for the whole organisation. Important, I think, to celebrate wins. It can be a really challenging time at times within charities. So to celebrate those wins together is a really important way to cement the relationship. And then understand and respect each other's roles. Everything stems, as you've probably sensed from my presentation so far, around trust and mutual respect between the chair and CEO. You don't necessarily need to like each other. You certainly shouldn't become close friends, but there does need to be a sort of healthy respect for each other's role and expertise and experience and professional background. When the chair lacks respect for the chief executive, they can become a bully, or they definitely can overstep their mark operationally, and vice versa. The chief exec can railroad things through the board. So working on that sort of sense of trust and mutual respect, getting to know each other, is a really important thing to do. And then I've put something around, and I'll give you some more detail on this at the end, getting some training, ideally together, around good governance and how you navigate that relationship. And there's a great training course, which I will mention later, that you might want to do if you're being appointed into a chief exec role rather. So thinking about interview. So you may be coming up for an interview as a potential charity chief exec. Of course, they are interviewing you, but you're also getting a sense of, is this a charity that, you know, I want to work at? And part of that is around checking in on what the relationship with the chair might look like and feel like. So I've just put some questions there that you might want to ask yourself and begin to get a feel for as you go for interview or embark on a recruitment process. So I suppose the first thing is kind of thinking about the chair. You might be meeting with them before having a formal interview. You might be able to have that kind of informal conversation. So do you have a sense that you can get on? You know, does it feel like somebody that you could build a rapport with? Do you have a feeling that you've got similar values and potentially a shared vision for the organisation? So beginning to kind of get a sense for it. And does your vision, you know, as you're working your way through getting a feel for the organisation as you're applying through the recruitment process, you know, your sense of what you would want to do to the charity, does that feel aligned with the chair's vision for the future? If they are miles apart, it's probably not the right organisation to go to. You might want to ask for role descriptions. You will have one obviously for the chief executive role, but you might want to ask for one for the chair and see if they have one and see what it says. Beyond that, I think there's just a sort of sense, and you can begin to sense this, is how engaged is the chair? You know, how much time are they giving to the organisation? You might want to ask them that. You know, what other things have they got going on? I mean, obviously you want to be respectful of this, but, you know, getting a sense of how engaged they are and how actively involved they are. How often do people see them in the office? How do they come to things? All that sort of stuff. You might also want to find out how much longer they have in the role, you know, where they are in their term. Are they likely to renew their term or not? That's a good thing, is if they're a great chair and you're going to love working with them, but they've only got 6 months more to go in the role, that's something to note. Conversely, if you think, okay, they're not quite a fit with me, but they've only got a few months left to go, again, so you can be pragmatic about that. You might want to find out what their expectations are in terms of communication. How often are they meeting with the current CEO? Where does that happen? How long? How easy are they to get hold of outside of kind of, you know, if you needed them at the end of a phone? And how experienced are they as a chair? You know, are they really experienced? Do they know what they're doing? Are they really well versed in governance? Those are the sorts of questions I think I would be getting, or sensing at least. Some of these you might ask directly, some of them you might sense at interview. So setting yourself up for success your first 100 days. So imagining that you are successful in the job, you found a place, a charity that really aligns with your values, you've got a good chair, and you're ready to go. What might you be thinking about in your first 100 days? So I think it's, in some ways, this is all the things that I've talked about so far. So being really clear at the outset, this is the ideal time when you're first starting a job, is to just sit down and be really clear about roles and expectations, agree on those communication protocols. How often are you going to meet? Get them in the diary, and to sort of build good habits and good protocols from the start. Set some early shared goals that, you know, will show that you as a new chief exec are, you know, confident about driving the organisation forward, and just really spending time with your chair to build that sort of foundation of trust. If you can do all of that in your first 100 days, get a sense of them to get a sense of you, and set up some good habits for the future, you'll be doing really well. And beyond the sort of first 100 days, I think it is about keeping learning and adapting. It's a dynamic relationship, to keep working on it. Maybe you have a change of chair at some point early on in your tenure. So kind of adapting to the person, regularly reviewing the relationship, sitting down with them and talking it all through on a regular basis. Identifying if there are challenges early on and working through them, and just maintaining that open, honest dialogue. Something I should have said earlier, but there's something about appreciating that your chair is a volunteer, and my chair used to say to me, I'm not at the end of an email, Kira, I'm out in my garden gardening, I've got other things to do, in a very nice way, but just a reminder that there are other things that going on in their life, and being respectful of that. So I think that's a really important part of just appreciating that kind of volunteer contribution too. I mentioned about useful resources, and there is some good stuff out there. It's worth having a look at the Charity Commission guidance. The training that I mentioned a few minutes ago is the training that Akivo, which if you haven't come across it, is the Association of Chief Executives of Voluntary Organisations. Fantastic organisation, well worth being a member of Akivo. They do lots of training, including a day's online course called Dynamic Duo, where you can go with your chair and have a whole day's discussion about the roles and responsibilities of the chair CEO. And they do it very well. They take the chairs off into breakout groups so the chairs can talk about being chairs. They have breakout rooms for the chief executives, and then they build in sessions during the day where you can talk to each other about the relationship using questions and prompts that they provide. So if you've not come across that, I would really recommend Akivo generally, but also specifically that training. And the parallel organisation, Akivo, is obviously the organisation for chief executives of charities. There's the Association of Chairs, and they have a really brilliant resource. I think it's about £20 that you can download from their website, called A Question of Balance, a guide to the chair and chief executive relationships. That's definitely one to get hold of if you're appointed to a role. So those were my kind of hints, tips, reflections on the mastering the chair CEO relationship. Louise is going to come in a second to take any of your questions, but I'm always happy to be connected with people on LinkedIn. Do feel free to connect with me. If you are preparing for an interview and you want a kind of coaching session to prepare yourself before you go into that, always happy to do that sort of thing. But also, if you've got additional reflections on this to add to what I've said, please do connect with me and let me know. So, Louise.
Excellent. Kira, that was brilliant. Having kind of worked across the charity sector now for many years, and from an interim perspective, having placed candidates into interim chief exec roles, I've kind of seen firsthand how boards behave. And obviously from an interim perspective, somebody has to arrive on day one and quickly build that relationship with the chair. They don't have that 100 days grace period. So I think, you could easily write a book on all the things that go well and perhaps all the things that don't go so well, to be honest. And there are huge challenges. I mean, just to touching on some of the things that you talked about, I think the chair ultimately is the leader of the board, and that individual has to have leadership skills. And I think where we see a tricky situations developing is where that chair's leadership ability is weak, and the board of the trustees, the rest of the trustees, start going adrift. And that's when you start to see those roles and responsibilities and those boundaries start to blur, where you may have trustees that are getting too involved in the executive, and really they need to be reined in, and the chair needs to step up and get everybody back on track. It's a hard nut to crack, but from your experience, if a chief exec is struggling with the board and them dipping in too much into the day-to-day of what the executive is up to, how might they broach that subject? I mean, how might they start the conversation with the chair to say, I just want to let you know, but...
It's an all too familiar story also, I think. So it's something definitely to be aware of, and people become chairs for all sorts of different reasons, often for very good reasons and often with very good leadership, but it definitely does happen. I mean, you want to do this, resolve this stuff as early as possible as you can, so when you don't let it become a problem. I think there's always worth having an eye on who is on the board, and there is usually one very sensible person on the board. It might not be obvious, it might be a quieter person, but it might be, if you don't feel like you can go straight to a conversation with the chair, that you are able to talk with a member of the board about how best can I, you're a member of the board, how might we navigate this issue? Because a chair that's ineffective will be clear to other trustees on the board that that is the case. So I think tackling it early, tackling it internally if you can, raising it, as you say, with your chair, but that's not easy if their leadership is poor. I think if things are really bad, there are things like mediation that that is not unusual for where conflicts arise or where issues are really difficult, for there to be a mediation conversation, which can put things back on track. Mediation can be a very positive thing for people to be able to have a conversation that they're not able easily to have themselves. And going back to Akivo, there is if you're a member of Akivo, there's a really good service called CEOs in Crisis, which is a sort of telephone hotline that they have, where they deal with this exact issue. So you can talk to somebody that's really experienced and they can give you advice, signpost you to resources and so on. So that would be my immediate take. What's your take, Louisa? What have I missed in all of that, do you think?
No, I think that's right. It's a tricky one, and ultimately it depends on the type of relationship that you have with your chair, which is why you go back to trying to set the foundations of that relationship quickly, so that you have that trust. So if there are niggles on either side, it reduces any kind of conflict, because you're not wanting to have any conflict. You're just trying to kind of resolve a situation where a member of the board may be starting to get too involved with a member of your team, and you need to correct that. I'm just hopping into our Q&A here, and we've got a question from one of our guests today, who's asking about best practice or around appraising chairs. Like you said, yes, the chief exec gets appraised, but who's appraising the chair, and how might that happen, and who actually undertakes that?
Yeah, I've seen this done a couple of ways. So I was on the board of Arts Council England, which is a arm's length body from Department for Culture, Media and Sport. And the practice there, which is standard practice, I think, for arm's length bodies, is to have a sort of nominated senior independent trustee. I've forgotten what different people call it different things, but effectively a member of the board who's given the remit to conduct an annual review, and whose job it is to talk to all other trustees and get feedback from the chair, from trustees and from the chief executive about the chair's performance. And I've seen that work very well, where that person that's given that remit is comfortable and confident and has the credibility to go and have those conversations, synthesize it into something and be able to feed it back to the chair. I think that works really well. And for a report, a sort of summary of that to be given to trustees, so there's a kind of audit trail of that having happened. I've done several kind of appraisals myself as a kind of consultant, often working with a charity, where as part of a wider board effectiveness review, I've been asked to do that. So I have done effectively a similar process and then written that up and fed it back to the chair in a sort of slightly coaching way. Here's the things that, always you should be providing your chair with the things that they're doing really well, and chairs hopefully will be doing some things well, and here's the things that people feel you could do better. So I've seen that work well. Those are two models that I've come across. I can't think of others that I've come across. Have you seen anything else, Louise, from your experience?
Sometimes, and I guess it depends on how quickly you might instigate something like this, but getting an external individual consultancy, it might be even a law firm that offers something like charity governance reviews, or like you talked about, board effectiveness, where a chief exec might feel, well, I think the chair needs to be appraised, but actually while we're at it, why don't we open it up and do a skills audit where everybody is kind of assessed for the value that they bring, and then that can also include expected behaviours and and ensure that the board and the rest of the trustees are all completely aligned, and that the chief exec is that. And that can be quite a good exercise to go through, but probably quite daunting for somebody who's never really done that before. So it's a tricky one. I would probably, like you say, use a Kivo who could potentially signpost you to individuals or organisations that could perhaps do that from an independent perspective. It might be easier to have that degree of separation.
Yeah.
Another lady has come in with another question here. How do you suggest new chairs and chief execs build trust quickly, especially in charities going through change? So how might those two critical individuals of the organisation quickly come together and build that trust, particularly when there may be other things going on, maybe not necessarily crisis, but significant change, transformation, redundancy program, a funding issue, what the external climate is moving, and the organisation might need to kind of pivot its strategy. How do you build that trust quite quickly?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, trust often takes time to grow, doesn't it? You need to kind of go through stuff and come out the other side to know what somebody is made of. But I think it's probably the obvious things, which is to spend some time together and to kind of scenario plan and kind of work things through together. I mean, there is nothing like a crisis to bond people. So, and I know you weren't saying it was a crisis, but man it through a period of change, and being really open and honest, and being clear, also like playing to your strengths, as both chief exec and chair. So I think spending time together, going through stuff together. I mean, I say this, and I'm also thinking about you also have to be careful not to exclude other trustees from this. It can't look like two people just driving an organisation forward and leaving the trustees behind. So there's something also about the wider sense of kind of the chair's job of bringing people along on the journey. But I would say, it takes time to build trust, but you can build trust by going through stuff together, being open and playing to each other's strengths, I think.
Just sort of touching on that. So in interim chief exec world, where something like that has to happen quite quickly, it wouldn't be uncommon for the interim to arrange for an away day,
Yes,
a board away day,
yes,
all together. Maybe the chief exec and a couple of members of the SLT, critical individuals on the SLT that would play into any potential strategy, or would be very, very useful individuals because of the change or the crisis that they're going through. They would have a voice in that as well. But a strategy away day, a board away day, I know sometimes it's hard to get diaries together, but that time away from the office, a time to convene people in a safe space with a clear agenda, with a clear goal of outcomes that you want to achieve. But that can also create that spending time together, but perhaps in a slightly more formal way, because people come away from that away day feeling far more kind of refreshed, enhanced, that relationship has perhaps taken leaps forward because of just the time that you've spent together.
It's a great point, and I see that. I mean, I facilitate loads of board away days, and you're right that when they work really well, you make because it's not like a board meeting where you've got loads of papers and it's very relatively formal. An away day allows you to be a bit more expansive, a bit more horizon scanning, a bit more strategizing, as you say, and also you've got the kind of the social stuff around us, but just spending time together, getting to know each other as people, what makes each other tick. So I think I should have said that. It's a great point.
Something else I was thinking on, and you touched on earlier about the term. So often it's 3 years plus 3 years plus 3 years. Generally speaking, by the end of your 9th year, it really ought to be time to be passing the baton over to someone else. But for example, you could join as a chief exec, your chair is in term one, they've indicated at the end of the 3 years they would like to renew. They then choose not to renew, and you are then faced with having built a relationship with a great chair. That chair has shown their cards, they're stepping down. There is a recruitment going on to recruit a new chair, and you're there, 3 years in, you've still got another good, 2 or 3 years left in you before you're then ready to step down. How does a chief exec cope with the transition of that relationship from the old to the new?
Yeah, well, super question, and something I'm right in the midst of actually, because I'm leading this search for a new chair for Arts University Plymouth, where I'm a governor. And it's interesting having conversations with the Vice Chancellor, who effectively is the chief executive, about all of that. I think it comes down to I think partly it comes down to succession planning. So it's a broader point about, I don't think enough charities do have a sense of sort of succession planning, either for the chief executive or the chair. It's not a very well established thing. We're just not very good at it. And by the time we come to think about succession planning, it's because somebody wants to move on. Whereas really you should be doing succession planning when people are coming in, rather than kind of when it's too late. I mean, I think there's something about, as a chief executive, valuing different kinds of chairs. And I was speaking to somebody earlier in the week, actually, who'd been a chief exec of a charity and has recently retired. So she was saying, I think she'd had 4 chairs, and very different chairs, and all brought something different, and all were right for the time, of the organisation and what it was that they needed. So they had a chair, I think it was quite a tech, digital driven organisation. At one point they had somebody that was kind of coming with that sort of mindset, kind of tech, not an entrepreneur exactly, but kind of that sort of. And then another time they were really keen on growing the organisation and got that. So I suppose there's something about, as a chief executive, embracing that change and recognizing that even if you adore your current chair, that actually you will bring your new chair if you get it right. And of course you can't exactly choose your new chair, but if the board gets it right, you're somebody that's going to bring new energy, new ideas, new skills, new perspectives, a bit of challenge that maybe you haven't had. Maybe you've got a bit too settled with your current chair, it's a bit too cozy. So I think there's something about having a kind of open mindset, a growth mindset, as in terms of, okay, what am I going to learn from this new person, rather than seeing it as a threat. I don't know, what do you think, Louise?
Yeah, it can be quite daunting, I think, for somebody who has joined the organisation, they completely bought into the chair, they're loving it all and everything's all honky-dory, and then suddenly there's this like fork in the road. That chief exec may actually question, is it also time for me to step down as well? Because actually I really, really enjoyed working with that person. I just can't imagine working with anybody else. And I think that's a very personal question. I think that's when you seek support from a coach or a mentor, your own network, your own friends, to see how that might look for you. But you're right, there's always value in that sense of newness, and it's about embracing it rather than kind of worrying about it, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that's where the succession planning thing's very important, because the instinct to potentially see that as your moment to exit, whilst it's completely natural to think that, it's quite risky for an organisation to lose a chair and a chief executive in quick succession. You really want it so that you can manage that transition, so that you don't have the 2 crucial people leaving around the same time. So if you can avoid that, I think it's really important to.
Yeah, and I think that is down to good communication. There are times where a chief exec will have confided in me that they're looking to step down by whatever date, and my next question is always, have you told the board yet? Are you planning to? What do you think their reaction will be? What type of timelines do you have in mind? And it may well be that they have timed they're stepping down because they can see the term of the chair also changing, and if you've got really good relationship with really open communication, you can together do that succession planning out in the open and plan it properly, rather than kind of dropping the bomb and going, oh, by the way, I've got a new job.
I'm off. Yeah.
I've got another question here. This is also very interesting. You mentioned earlier in the presentation about how the relationship between the chief exec and the chair absolutely kind of sets the culture for the rest of the organisation. When that's working well, it's all happy days. How do they set the culture through that relationship? And it's perhaps more tricky in a very large organization with, potentially hundreds, if not thousands of employees that might not feel culture so much as people perhaps sitting on the SLT. So the question is, how should they model the culture through the way they work together? And then how does that work in large organizations where the relationship might be much less visible?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that culture is, what it feels like to work in this place, isn't it? It's the kind of intangible stuff that you feel. It's not the stuff that's written down. It's the stuff like that you just feel the kind of culture of the organization when you're in it, or you engage with it. And so I do think that the nature of the respect and trust and quality of the relationship that's between the chair and chief executive leaks out in terms of the organization. And I see it a lot. So I see it a lot around staff teams that don't feel empowered, a culture that is kind of not that trusting, and every decision has to go right up to the chief exec and the senior leadership team. That I find that often working with teams. And I think that that the chair and chief exec need to model that relationship, all of those sort of being collaborative, being open, being transparent, feeling the chief exec feeling empowered in the way that they should do, that's appropriate to do so. And if that doesn't happen, you absolutely, even in a lot, so especially in a large organization where that is not visible, it just leaks out, doesn't it? So I think so that is about setting the tone, that how those two people interact, how they trust and respect one another, what values, organizational values that may be agreed on, how they embody those values and how they demonstrate those in the interactions that they have with each other, but also with others. All of that sets a tone that other people pick up. And I work with lots of senior leadership teams and say, I think often at senior leadership levels, you don't realize that the staff around you are constantly looking at you and noticing signs and signals about the culture and about how you feel about things. They constantly, the antennae is constantly up, and it will come from the chair and the chief executive. So that's why I'm saying that it is the most crucial relationship in a way for the chief executive, because it has that sort of filtering effect on everybody else. And when it works well, it's got it feels like we used to have AGMs because we were public service mutual. So we would have people coming, and people want, if people can see a chair and chief executive that are totally aligned, very respectful for one another, it's a very compelling relationship to see played out on a kind of open stage, and people will go with that and kind of lead that through the rest of the organization. And if they don't see it, the opposite is true.
Yeah, exactly. I've seen that myself in a very large organization where there was tension between the chief exec and the board. The board were quite demanding in terms of the information that they wanted, and the chief exec ends up almost trying to provide air cover to the SLT to kind of protect his team from this kind of slightly overbearing board that were demanding information like all of the time and not being respectful of the SLT's time either. It could be heavy demands at the wrong time of day. and the chief exec was trying to fend off the board, was trying to protect his team, and that tension was very visible and very felt. So yeah, really critical. I'm conscious of time. I've got another question to run through here. Another lady said, I was interested that you were suggesting a weekly check-in, which was more than I was expecting. How do you ensure these meetings are kept strategic when you are meeting so regularly?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that the weekly check-in is probably, are you okay as chief exec? Is there anything that's going on that I need to be aware of? And where are we with X, Y, and Z? So they need not be long, but and almost by exception in a way of kind of like, and I do think that kind of, so many chief execs are on a path to burnout at the moment. That they're holding lots, as you say, Louise, they're holding stuff from their own board. They're holding so much. And I think the chair is the only person that it's really looking at for the chief exec, or should be looking at. So I think a kind of well-being check on the chief exec, like, how are you? What's going on for you? It's the most important question on a weekly basis. And then it's a kind of risk assessed approach of like, what's going on that I need to be aware of. Nothing, fine, leave you to it. So it need not be long, but I think the regularity of it is important. And then the monthly meetings are much more about, especially in the board cycle, of kind of, okay, well, where are we with this, and this? What's coming up on a kind of senior HR front that we need to be aware of, so there's no surprises. So that's what I would say for the weekly catch up is, just that regular check-in.
Yeah, definitely weekly. It doesn't matter how experienced you are as a chief exec or a chair, the weekly check-in is vital. Things can easily slip in the charity's life cycle. A week can be quite a long time if there's a lot of stuff going on. Like you say, it doesn't have to be long, it doesn't have to be overtly strategic. It could be a well-being check-in. How are you doing? How's your week been? How did you get on with so-and-so? Are there any issues that have come up? What have we got planned for next week? If you need my help, I'm available on these days. I've got board meetings elsewhere next Wednesday. I can't do next Wednesday, but it's that type of thing. It's relationships, well-being, and maintaining that contact so that when it really is kicking off, you've got that real solid trust between you. You know exactly what's going on in each other's lives as well, where appropriate.
Exactly.
Excellent. Well, look, I think we are unfortunately coming to a close. Like I said, we could write a book on this and we could quite easily natter on for another hour or so this afternoon. But I do hope that everybody listening has had a wonderful experience, that you've really enjoyed the conversation, and that you've taken, or that you can take something away. We at Starfish always open to having sort of conversations with you about your own career progression. And as Kara said, please do reach out to her directly if there's any support that she can offer you in terms of your next steps as well. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.